like to introduce our next speaker, Jonathon Tyson. And I think many of you know Jonathon. He's been away for a while, but is back. And Jonathon is now the relationship manager for WCB Nova Scotia. But that's not the reason he's here. He left a large legacy when he left Ontario. And many of you, most of you, I would think, have seen some of the work that he shepherded through. And keeping together the wide and varied group of individuals who were part of that is a testament to Jonathon's tenacity and general interest in this area. So I'll just change your presentation and then we can move ahead.
So Richard said I left have big shoes, so when I got to hard to fill it is great to be here today, and I'm honored to be asked back to sort of talk about the guideline. As Richard indicated, a lot of the guideline work was done by a group of dedicated individuals from within the system. I had the role of project manager, but it was really, I couldn't have done it by myself. There was a lot of good input from people from all of the safety associations, from the WSIB, from the Ministry of Labor, from corporate entities coming together to talk about how do we want to provide information to workplaces to help them move forward on MSD prevention. Thanks, Richard. So today I'm going to do a condensed history, a brief history of time with respect to the MSD prevention guideline. Many of you will have heard this before. Hopefully everybody has actually seen and looked at these documents. Is anyone not? Come on, show your hands if you haven't. Okay, one, Brian, two, okay. But right, it's a test, right? But the work that this represents really was starting. It started out, if we want to go back far enough, I think it really started out in my mind back in 1998. So this is 25 years ago. We had a group of ergonomists from within the system meet on a fairly regular basis to say, what do we do about this? We're struggling, we're trying to address MSDs, we're trying to bring it and make it a priority for prevention. At that time, prevention in a lot of the safety associations was on the, on falls prevention, on severe traumatic injuries, whereas, as we all know, MSDs were the biggest bulk of all our injuries. So we actually wrote a nice little white paper, submitted it to the WSIB, got some very good feedback on it, and nothing happened. So we sort of went about our jobs, kept working away, and in 2005, OSHCO, which was the Occupational Health and Safety Council of Ontario, so representatives of all of the safety associations, chaired by the Ministry of Labor, WSIB, were all there to talk about how do we work together, amazing concept, work together in Ontario to look at common strategies for prevention and accident and injury prevention in the province. And these began in 2005 to look at a 5-year strategic plan. And in initial feedback on what the discussions were on that plan, there was no willingness or no seeming willingness to sort of move towards putting MSD prevention on the priorities for the strategic plan. So with a lot of work behind the scenes, a number of people sort of pushed that issue and managed to get MSD prevention as one of the key strategic elements for the plan in place to move forward. So 2006, we drafted a strategy, which is more than just the guideline, and I'll talk about that briefly in a second. And we presented this to the OSHCO group, and they agreed that it was something they wanted to do, and we began work on it. So really, we started working on this in 2006. And the work began and was implemented and continued from 2006 until 2008. So really, we had a 2-year time frame of fairly aggressive work on trying to implement the various elements of the full MSD prevention strategy. So the full MSD prevention strategy, however, was aided and abetted and supported by some of the work that the ministry also started at the same time. So I think it was interesting because from my point of view, we started having discussions about the strategy and rolling it out, and there was some general support there, but when the minister stood up and said this is important, then all of a sudden people started to actually think it was important, and we had a lot more support. The minister at that time had a trouble saying musculoskeletal, so it was the sprains and strains strategy for the Ministry of Labor, or pains and strains, sorry. So they started their pains and strains campaign in 2006, and they were focusing on MSD hazards by the inspectors, and this really did help to move that strategy along. I think both from a workplace perspective and support and involvement in the consultation part of the strategy, and also from internal within the health and safety system. The overall MSD strategy that we were looking at was primarily focused internal to the health and safety system in Ontario. So the question really was, what can we do as a system to help to improve and enhance and encourage MSD prevention activity within workplaces in Ontario? So it was about how do we increase awareness, how do we support workplaces in terms of providing them with guidance and tools, and how do we motivate that MSD prevention activity? So a lot of this was how do we do a better job as a system to do that? So there's 9 areas. I think looking back, we were probably over ambitious. We had lots of great ideas, and we thought these 9 areas of the strategy were what we wanted to try to focus on. And so the first one was a generic guideline, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Sector-specific MSD prevention materials. So we have a generic guideline. Now, how do we support that material for healthcare, for construction, for manufacturing, for pulp and paper? How do we increase the awareness and knowledge of frontline staff within the system? Because we have health and safety consultants who had been long-time health and safety consultants who would not touch anything to do with this word ergonomics, right? They would go into workplaces, and if someone was talking about the back injuries, well, we don't deal with that. We'll help you with your policies and procedures and your accident and incident investigation, but if you want to solve your health and safety, your back injuries, then you'll have to call on our ergonomist. And how many ergonomists did we have within the system? Carrie, 8, 9, 10 maybe, for the whole province at that time. So it was a difficult thing. And we wanted those frontline staff to have more knowledge and ability to help with those workplaces. And then obviously we want the employers and workers to have more awareness and knowledge of the system to help motivate that activity. We wanted to look at how do we integrate MSD prevention into existing programs and services. So we had a lot of training programs. We want to make sure we incorporate the message around MSD prevention into those. What is the business case for MSD prevention? So the real cost, the cost drivers and the number and incidents. Research, so it really was how do we take that knowledge that CRE-MSD and other organizations are doing and bring it in and let people know about it and make it practical and applicable. Looking at the whole concept of MSD prevention and safe design. And this is interesting because when we originally drafted the strategy, this wasn't an element, one of the key elements, but then there was a lot of talk at that time about the whole concept of safe design. So how do we make sure right off the bat, right from the concept stage of a product, a procedure, a facility, that we incorporate safety into that design. And the last one was around measurement and evaluation. And you would think that one should be easy, but it was probably one of the most frustrating ones we ever had to try to deal with, was the whole concept of how do we measure this and evaluate it. So those were the 9 areas. We had some success in all areas, I would say, but not as much as we hoped. And I think partly we were under-resourced. Everyone's always under-resourced. We never have enough people or money to do what we want to do. But we also had wavering levels of commitment for lack of a better way of saying it. I don't work here anymore. I can probably say this, right? All right. We had individuals who at the table said yes, but then when you ask them to commit support and some resources to help move it forward, oh well, we can't do that. This isn't. There's no way we can do that. The measurement and evaluation piece was probably one of the most frustrating pieces when we started talking about how we're going to measure this, how we're going to evaluate it. What do we want the individual safety associations to do in terms of collecting data and providing data and sharing that data? Well, that wasn't going to happen, right? IAPA and USA and CSAO, and they weren't going to share their data and talk about what they were doing, and so we could actually compare and see whether or not there were different levels of activity. So that was a bit of a frustration. And so a lot of the work really did end up being, the focus of the work ended up being on the development of the guideline, which stretched out into the guideline, the resource manual, and then the 3 subsequent toolboxes. From our simple approach of the guideline, and as I think when you look at the standard, which is 154 pages long, you realize it has to be that length if you're going to provide enough information for an organization to be able to take something and even start to use it. So the guideline really was a multi-stakeholder consultation process. We know we probably could have sat at the table and written a very similar document by ourselves with the people around the table, but that wasn't going to be beneficial. We needed to get out there. We needed to talk with other ergonomists, with the researchers, with people from industry to say, right, this is a guideline. What is it we need to have in it? How's it going to work in your organizations? How is it going to be, what kind of content do you want in it? And then move forward from there. So the guideline itself is, it's that first relatively short document. So it really provides what we consider to be a high-level framework for MSD prevention. It's high-level, and again, it's process-oriented. And then more detailed information about how to actually implement it is provided in the resource manual. So each of the steps in the framework is talked about in the resource manual. And if you remember the framework, the framework starts with building the foundation. And when I compare the guideline to other things like health and safety management standards or Z1004, really that's where it all starts. It starts with building the foundation, getting the commitment, putting the planning in place, making sure the resources are in place. So a lot of the content, the philosophy behind the framework is very similar to what the health and safety management standards are looking for. And then to support that, we have the toolboxes. And the toolboxes are designed to try to be sequential in the level of information provided. So if somebody's a small business, they could start with toolbox A, which is what we call getting started, and then moving beyond that into more complex or more in-depth assessment type tools, so that workplaces can go from fairly simple to moving into more complicated as they gain more experience and have successes. So one of the key elements of the guideline is the focus on participation. Throughout every element of the guideline, we stress the need for participation of workers in the process. And we see this a lot in a lot of standards. We see the concept of participation as being there. But I think what makes perhaps the guideline different than the standard is that we're not saying that workers should only participate under certain circumstances. We're really trying to stress that workers need to participate in as many and in all circumstances where possible. That all workers need to be informed about what MSD hazards are, and all workers need to be involved in the process of identifying them and then working to reduce exposure to those hazards, right? And it's not only a worker representative who goes out there and asks for their opinion and then comes back to the table. It's how do we get those workers more involved in the day-to-day process. It is about recognize, assess, and control hazards. It's a standard thing. We started, as I said, in my mind, we started this sort of work 25 years ago. Today we're talking about how do we continue this work and move forward, because it's more relevant today perhaps than it was then, that we actually start action and start getting things done. And it's about integrating into existing health and safety programs, systems, and activities. It's about we take what we've got good programs, how do we make sure that we generate the knowledge and awareness to focus on those MSD hazards, right? Sorry, Brian, they're not ergonomic risk factors. They're not. Ergonomics is how we solve the problem, right? They're design factors, they're organizational factors, they're, all of those things. And when we look at them as hazards, like we would for any other hazard, then I think we focus on the right thing. We're looking at what is it that impacts the person that causes those injuries or disorders to occur. Foundation for success, again, I said it's management, commitment, communication, participation, reporting, communicating of prevention efforts, training, and planning. A lot of the stuff, if you take those elements, they're in that Z1004 standard. Right? It's recognizing the hazards. So what are the proactive ways of doing this in terms of inspections, surveys, physical demands, descriptions, and hazard identification tools? And then reactive approaches. So yes, we have injuries, have MSDs. How do we know we have them? How do we know where they are? Are we doing investigations? I still, in my work today, the relationship manager at the WCB, I'm one of many relationship managers. I work with the health and social services team. I don't go out there and counsel people on how to work together better. What I do is primarily work with large healthcare employers on their issues with the board, policy, procedures, costs, and so forth. But about 40% of my time is looking at safe lift and transferring in hospitals. So we have a project in healthcare in Nova Scotia to look at a common approach to addressing safe patient handling in hospitals, because it is the #1 cause of injury in healthcare, not only in Nova Scotia, right? 80% of all injuries in healthcare in Nova Scotia are MSIs or MSDs. For some reason, Nova Scotia, we call them MSIs. It took me 3 years to change over my mindset, right? But 80% of all injuries are musculoskeletal in healthcare, and half of those come from some sort of patient, client, resident handling process, right? So it's a focus very similar to me in the approach we took to the guideline. Right? We're going out there and consulting and working with frontline staff and workers and managers and representatives to say, how do we solve this problem and address it? And it comes down to all of these things we're talking about today, but in a very specific application setting. And then the risk assessment. And this, if we had controversy and issues, this is probably the area where we started to have the most controversy and issue, right? What we suggested from a simple risk assessment process in the guideline was, if you have injuries, talk to the workers. If you can agree on what the problem is, fix it, right? Why does it need to be more complicated than that, right? So that was really what we were trying to get at. So it was in the consulting world, there's the word, it's another name for it, but it's about, finding those quick fixes right away, those things that are going to be those easy wins. And to me, this is the approach. If you go out there and actually sit down with workers where they're having injuries and you talk to them about what is it that they think is having the injury, and that makes sense, and you can do something about that, then that's going to be a quick win, and it's going to allow you to move on to those more complex ones that might need more in-depth risk assessment, which is where we talked about a more traditional ergonomics approach, where we're actually doing lots of measurements and using tools and so on. We don't know why I had all these bullet points, but we have a risk assessment checklist, which was based on the Washington State Caution Zone checklist. It was a bit, again, controversial, because one of the things we did was, when we were talking about the whole concept of hazard identification versus risk assessment within MSDs, we actually had an international group of experts. So Barbara Silverstein, Niels Fallon from, where is he from?
Yes, from Denmark.
From Denmark, and Richard and somebody else, can't remember who else, but anyway, we had a group, these people come together to talk about what is it that is there such a thing as hazard identification for MSD hazards? And the general consensus out of that was no, there isn't, because we can't identify hazards without really starting along some level of risk assessment, some sort of, you can't, everything has MSD hazards, right? I mean, everything you do sitting right here has MSD hazards. So is sitting an MSD hazard by itself, or is sitting only for a certain length of time, or working in a posture for a certain length of time? You know, reaching above my head, yes, that might be a hazard, but if I only do that once every 8 hours, then we're not concerned. So you have to start adding some level of risk assessment to that. Right? So some thought it was there was some controversy around this in terms of one of the biggest concerns, especially from industry, was it becoming a regulatory tool. That the ministry was going to take it and say this is now going to be enforceable if you exceed any of these levels. Unfortunately, I believe that hasn't happened. Okay. And then it goes on to controls, again, participative approaches to this, communication and planning for implementation, training on those controls, and evaluation. Is it working? So now you've done the control, is it working? So all very simple, basic stuff that you would think should be involved in any sort of approach to controlling hazards in the workplace. And then the last step of the framework is evaluation and communicating. So we're evaluating specific controls, but now are we evaluating our approach to MSD prevention on the whole? Right? Are we reassessing what we're doing? Are we making sure it's working? Are we getting feedback from workers about how they're involved? And are we applying assessment tools? And then communicating results. So the guideline, as I said, was created to be generic for all workplaces, to be useful to smaller employers as well as a reference perhaps to larger employers. So an organization like Michelin Tires or Ford or Ontario Power Gen, they have staff, they have resources. This wasn't written for them specifically, although perhaps they could use it. But really a lot of those smaller, medium-sized employers was our prime focus of where we wanted this information to go to. Right? I think the key aspects of the framework are consistent with occupational health and safety management systems, and the focus on process and participation was there rather than a focus on technical aspects that we might see in some standards. Right? I think one of the things when we were putting this together, we had lots of talking about what does it mean to do. When we're talking about MSD prevention, what does that look like? And I think the guideline, one of the strengths of it is that it recognizes that the MSD prevention isn't strictly a technical problem. It's not how high your table is, it's not how heavy the object is, it's not how many times you do it, because it's an aspect of the social technical system and that match between people and the technical system. So to do that, to solve that problem, you have to have those people involved. You have to recognize that even if we design to a so-called standard of X number of units or X number of repetitions per, or a certain amount of weight at a certain amount of distance, a certain amount of time, there are going to be people who are outside that standard, who do not fit. And unless we start talking with those people and involving them in the process, we're not going to really know how that works impacting those people. Because we don't go out there and measure everybody. We don't put electrodes on everybody and measure all that stuff. Right? If we are just strictly going with a checklist standard or a numbers-based standard, we're not going to solve the problem without actually involving people and talking with them about how that work affects them. And I think that was one of the things that we were trying to get at with the guideline. So Richard said 7 years. I always calculated as the guideline in 2007, 2008. So I went, so to me I said 5 years. I think it's a great opportunity to look at the guideline, review it, consider whether or not we need to update it or change it, consider on how it matches or merges or can support Z1004. This kind of day is a great opportunity to have that. Right? I would say that anecdotally, I don't have any research papers or any anything scientific to support this, but from talking with people, I think the guideline has been a success at increasing awareness. Lots of people have downloaded it, lots of people have been given it and been talked about it. Has been a success in helping to increase MSD prevention activity. I know that ergonomic consultants out there are promoting it and discussing the guideline. That large and small and large organizations refer to it both as a reference, and some of them take parts of it and use parts of it and as it fits their organization and as they need it. Just one former IEPA ergonomist told me that they worked with the Durham School Board using the guideline, and the board actually ended up having a 65% reduction in MSD claims. So I think, with guidance, with support, there are workplaces who have taken that information from the guideline and have been able to apply it and has some success. And I know that some of the current health and safety organizations in Ontario are still incorporating it into their training program. So it's there, it's still being used, which is, I think, a testament to the work that everybody did and the fact that that has some success. I wish we could say we did a full, thorough investigation and evaluation of it, but we didn't. As we move forward, I think that's one of the key things. As we move forward, we need to find a way to evaluate our ongoing efforts with respect to MSD prevention. It's in my current work in Nova Scotia, we just went through a process, and Nova Scotia has a new health and safety strategy. And it's got 5 elements, and one of which is measurement and evaluation. In the work on safe lift and transfer in healthcare, we've been talking with others who have done projects in healthcare on what they call model of care and also falls prevention in healthcare. And the biggest problem they've had is evaluation, because the systems are not in place, the data isn't being collected to actually do good evaluation. So I think if anything comes out of this, we need to talk about how do we make sure we have those good systems, because we're not talking about the numbers the WSIB can give us, because those are things we don't care about, right? What we care about is what levels of activity are going on, who's being trained, how are we modifying and changing and implementing controls, right? Those are the things we need to be measuring. And those are things we're not doing, I think, as a system, not only in Nova Scotia, but I would argue here as well.